Hey everyone, my name is Raelan and I have a really exciting video for you today. I have two incredible people here to chat with you. I have Liz, who you might know from my channel, Liz Carlson, and also from all the incredible work that she does supporting people with CFS. You know her from her website, Heal with Liz, and on her social spaces as Heal with Liz as well. And then I also have Dr. John Greally. He is a physician and a researcher. He combines his work as a physician working in the Bronx, New York, and also does lab research on genomics and human disease. And he is doing some groundbreaking research on CFS. So it is really exciting and really an honor to have him here today. So hello, both of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Hey, Ryan.
Yeah, Liz, why don't you jump in and let everybody know how the three of us all got connected?
Yeah, well, Raelan and I are friends, and a Facebook friend of mine was raising money through a site called Kernels, and that site actually allows donors to directly fund biomedical research labs. So that's how I found out about this platform. So I was inspired and I reached out to Kernels and I was like, hey, do you have any projects in the CFS research space? And they actually said, yeah, their contact at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York had an CFS genomics study they wanted to get off the ground. And then shortly after, Raelan, myself, Dr. Greally, the Kernels team, we connected and we're here today. And Raelan and I know we're both really excited about this research, which we're going to get into shortly. And I do want to say thanks to the Kernels team and Sean McMahon at Albert Einstein for making this happen. And Dr. Greally, I'm just really honored to be sitting across from a top geneticist who's investigating CFS, which is a debilitating condition and affected me, and it affects, I know, over 1 million people just in the US alone, yet it receives very little research funding in comparison. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks to the two of you for having me involved with this. If you're going to use subtitles, it's an Irish accent. I'm from Ireland originally, from the west of Ireland, in Galway. I've been working in the United States basically my entire career. Started off training as a pediatrician in Pittsburgh, and then did my training in genetics, clinical genetics at Yale, and then started to get into more of a research track as the human genome sequence was being delivered to us in the research community. I have a very strong interest in this area called epigenetics, and we have our own particular take on what's involved with that kind of research. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I see patients in clinic in the Bronx, and I spend the rest of my week looking at the genome. And the whole point is, how do we use the genome to understand disease? So that's fundamentally what I do every day. It's a real privilege to have this as a career. It's a wonderful time to be able to use genomic technologies to try to understand things about human disease.
So I know a lot of people will be interested to hear, because Liz and I are quite involved with the CFS community. We both have long histories with this illness ourselves. And I think the one thing that we hear over and over and over again is just this desperate plea for more research. It feels like there's so little being done. So it's so incredible to come across someone who is doing some. So what got you into CFS research specifically? Because I know you do research in a variety of areas.
Well, I suppose that it's likely that most people know somebody with CFS, and certainly I have friends back in the west of Ireland who have CFS, and you see it, you know that it's affecting their lives dramatically. It's incredibly incapacitating, and you're, as a physician, as a genomics researcher, you're wondering, who's studying this? And for a long time I assumed somebody must be looking at this. And then I realized, no, they're not. It was when my good colleague, collaborator, friend Ian Lipkin at Columbia got in touch with me and said, John, we're thinking of putting together a project for this, that I realized that it's only recently that the NIH has really given substantial funding to start looking into this condition. it was an eye-opener for me, and I feel like it's a great opportunity and very, very timely, because if COVID has left us with one realization, it is that post-viral syndrome of long COVID, which resembles ME/CFS in so many ways, has woken people up to the realization that ME/CFS is real. ME/CFS is incredibly debilitating. It's very common, and we need to understand more about it.
So Dr. Greally, can you tell us about the ME/CFS genomics research that you are planning to embark on, and what do you hope to find out?
Well, I'm part of this project, as I said, with Ian Lipkin, but also with a whole set of other individuals. We've got 4 clinicians who are expert in ME/CFS. There's a colleague, Oliver Feen, who works in UC Davis, who's doing metabolomics work. We have a colleague in Harvard, and some of the intramural investigators at the NIH, the scientists who work at the NIH and have their own research programs. So it's a genuinely national collaborative center, and it's run out of Columbia University and led by Ian. My task in this was to work with Oliver on trying to understand what the results of sophisticated omics tests, as they would be described, we could show. And they're called omics because they all end in the suffix omics. So Oliver is this brilliant metabolomics guy. He looks at the products of metabolism, the small molecules that indicate how cells are processing the things that cause them to have nutrition, and what they do internally to turn over molecules. So Oliver is doing wonderful work on metabolomics. My task, unsurprisingly, was genomics. That's what we do. So our focused requirement was to try to figure out what was happening with the expression of genes in the blood cells that were circulating in individuals with ME/CFS. So we have some very sophisticated studies that are not just, let's take a sample of blood, put it into a tube and check that out. The patients would have their blood drawn before and after something like an exercise challenge to see whether you would elicit the changes in what was going on in the cells only following a challenge, which to the ME/CFS patients who are advising our center was very resonant. They said, that is when we feel at our worst. So it made sense from a scientific point of view, but also it felt like it made sense to the actual people who suffered from this condition. We also have these very special tubes that allow us to stimulate the cells of the peripheral blood in specific ways. And it's turning out that if you don't do these extra steps, you don't find anything. The previous studies that have been performed, which have been doing the same sort of work but on a smaller scale, have been quite ambiguous in their results. What we have found is that if you just do that standard approach, you'll find no changes in the expression of the genes in the blood cells. But the way that we're doing it with the exercise challenge and by stimulating the cells to become active, that's where we start seeing very distinctive things in the ME/CFS patients. So it's really rewarding a careful and detailed approach. We're beginning to see some new things that haven't been described before.
This is very exciting for so many different reasons. When I'm listening to you talk, of course, we need to find answers. We need to get more information so we have treatment options. But also, I know that for me and many people I talk to, it's also just very validating to have these markers or have this research done that shows that things are changing in our body, because many of us are dismissed. Many of us are told it's all in our head or we're exaggerating. And most of us, or many of us, get, tens of thousands of dollars worth of tests done that all come back normal. And there's just nothing in there. So every time I hear about something like this that is showing yes, something is happening, something is happening in our body. So even just this for me is very exciting to hear.
How long did it take for you to get diagnosed, Raelan?
I had a shorter journey than most people. I was diagnosed, I'd say, within about 6 months. But I also grew up with a mother with chronic fatigue syndrome, so this was not new to me, and it was already in my mind as something that it could be. And I landed on a doctor, an integrative medicine doctor who was more in tune with chronic illness. So yeah. How about for you, Liz? How long did it take?
Well, my network in the Bay Area, which I thought was great, my infectious disease doctor, he believed illnesses had a beginning and an end. And I was just told I had post-viral fatigue, and then sent off, and then went through the gamut of doctors, even though I had this distinct post-exertional crash, which was, as you know, almost paralyzing anytime I exerted myself just a teensy bit, and that could have been walking a half a block too far instead of my 2-block radius, and ended up on the couch for 10 days. But I actually had to fly across the country and see a specialist who then told me, yes, this is a classic case of ME/CFS. And I know I'm actually lucky because a lot of people don't have the money to see specialists, which cost hundreds of dollars. Some are even $1,000 per hour. We need early intervention, and that starts with diagnostic markers. So that's why I'm really excited about this research and the fact that you can measure the expression of genes post-exertion. That's just amazing. Yeah.
So if we were to break it down in layman terms for people like us that get a little bit lost in all of the the research terms and whatnot, I know you're talking about markers, but is part of your research meant to be to come up with a diagnostic tool, or is it more treatment oriented?
It's both. I know that's a bit of a cop-out to say both, but it is actually both. If there's a major focus, it would be to try to understand the mechanism of this condition. What's going wrong? And if you can figure out the mechanism of the condition, then you are setting the path towards therapy. It's a bumpy, long, and twisty road to go from an understanding of mechanism to a therapy, but at least you're on a road at that stage. And as you say, if physicians are ignoring your symptoms or do not have a test that we can offer to validate what it is that you're going through, it's enormously frustrating. So that leads us to the second part of why we do this, which is to come up with some sort of diagnostic test. If we're able to say to clinicians around the country and around the world, take your patient, have a blood draw, then do some sort of challenge to them, whatever it might be, and then do a second blood draw, and send it for this specific test, then your diagnostic odyssey can be very, very short compared with what people go through today. And certainly what you're describing sounds very typical. People have a long, long search to get somebody to come up with this diagnosis for them.
The diagnostic odyssey. Well said. Yes. So, Dr. Greally, you said you study epigenetics. Can you explain what epigenetics is in a way our audience could understand?
And that Liz and I can understand.
Epigenetics is unfortunately a bit of a catch-all term for many different things, but the most common way of describing it would be as the information that tells genes when to switch on and off. And the idea when applied to disease is that if a gene is inappropriately low in its expression due to these regulatory influences that we call epigenetic, and that in some way causes disease, that's a problem. And the question of how it ended up being expressed at low levels is often linked to environmental exposures, something in your diet, your environment, your previous exposures to illness, whatever it might be, including infectious illness. So that I would call the dogma. It's the belief. Having said that, there are probably about another 4 definitions that float out there. There's the definition which is very much those who are focused on what the biochemical mechanisms are of switching the genes on and off. And it's related, but it's not necessarily as disease related. There's the question of whether things that happen in one generation can be passed on to subsequent generations. Now, we have a mechanism for that, and it's called our DNA. But people are interested in non-genetic or non-DNA-based ways of transmitting these memories. So they call that epigenetic as well. So depending on who you talk to, people will define epigenetics in different ways. And personally, what I like people to say is, what exactly do you mean by epigenetics if you are talking to a specialist? And that way it tends to clarify the kind of work that they're doing and the kinds of questions that they're asking.
And I hope this isn't a dumb question, but what is a gene? I know people, it's part of our DNA, but can you explain what actually is a gene in terms of how things work in our body?
I can. I can explain what a gene is. So genes are only a tiny amount of all of the DNA that we have. We have 3 billion nucleotides. These are A, C, G, and T nucleotides. So 3 billion nucleotides, but only a few percent of all the nucleotides are genes. The way I described it to somebody once was, if you're driving on a highway, it's mostly highway and very occasionally an exit. And if you can imagine, the genes are the exits. But most of the time, you're just going in between the pieces of the gene or the genes themselves. So the genes are these little precious pieces of all of our DNA, very small subset. And the reason that they are interesting is because they get turned into RNA, which is related to DNA in terms of having a complementary sequence. And then that RNA goes out into the sort of factory floor of the cell outside the nucleus, into where all of the activity really takes place, and it gets turned into protein. So genes are the building blocks, or the template, more accurately, for proteins. And once you have a protein can start to have an enzymatic function and start converting other molecules into useful things. Proteins can build structures themselves. Proteins can move around the body and transmit signals. So fundamentally, in order to have a cell that is functional, we need to have a way of generating proteins, and different proteins with different activities in different cell types. So that's why different genes get expressed in different cell types. And then if you have the cell has to respond to some sort of stress, you will, even though it's the same cell type, you'll start to switch on different genes in response to whatever that stress is. So in the case of our studies of the ME/CFS patients, the cells in the blood are expressing a certain panel of genes. But when we stress the patient in some way through an exercise test, for example, all of a sudden, a different small set of genes start to respond and become either increased in the amount of RNA and presumably protein that they're producing, or decreased. And that is what we can measure with these genomic technologies, which then gives us an insight into what the cell is doing that is unusual in the individual with ME/CFS versus somebody who does not have ME/CFS.
You get all that, Liz? I'm going to quiz you at the end of our chat.
I'm so glad I asked that because now I feel like I know so much.
No, but I'm going to be calling you Hermione from now on. After Harry Potter.
Oh, wondering, I'm like, I don't get that reference either. God, I am clueless on this one.
She was
this is very, very detailed.
Very diligent, very smart. It's a compliment.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yes. When I interviewed Liz on my channel ages ago, and she sent me over 30 pages of notes for her interview. I just have so much respect for the amount of preparation and work that she puts into things.
Well,
I'm kind of thinking dialing it back a little bit from the details though, because in terms of research, I'm not so familiar with how research works at all. So for this specific ME/CFS research, how are you finding your participants? How long is this all going to take? What just generally does that look like?
This is a multi-center consortium that we put together, and it includes several clinicians who have been caring for individuals with ME/CFS for a long time. So they have identified a group of patients who have clearly got ME/CFS by the best criteria that we have. You won't see the medical textbooks with very clear criteria. It hasn't really reached that stage yet. But within the ME/CFS clinical community, people talk about things like if you put somebody with ME/CFS and you stand them up or you sit them up, and they have a very distinctive pattern of their blood pressure changing. It's not that it drops as much as it narrows the amount. So we always talk about the systolic blood pressure over the diastolic blood pressure, and somebody says my blood pressure is 110/70, for example. That's systolic, that's diastolic. What happens with somebody with ME/CFS after you stand them up, and this is something I learned through working in this center, is that the systolic blood pressure will go down. The diastolic blood pressure may go down a little bit, but they narrow. So now the amount of blood that's moving with every heartbeat is decreased because there's more resistance to it. That difference between the big value and the small value is in effect the amount of thrust that the heart is able to give to the blood as it moves around the body. So no wonder these poor patients are feeling awful when you just elevate them. It makes a lot of sense because we can see that from their blood pressure recordings. So our colleagues who are specialized in looking after patients with ME/CFS have, very diligently been studying these kinds of observations for years. And to them, there are clear criteria for saying that somebody has ME/CFS. So it's not like we don't have any diagnostic capability right now. It's just that the diagnostic tools are very clinical, and lab tests that are more specific and sensitive would be very valuable to add to these existing clinical tools.
And I think a part of the problem, I would imagine as well, is that most of us, when we become unwell with this, we don't know what's going on. We go to our GP, our family doctor that we've been seeing our whole life. And that information, that diagnostic, criteria might not have trickled down, to every, family doctor that's out there.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. And I've had my own sort of journey in terms of understanding ME/CFS. I did not know a huge amount about it before getting involved with this center in Colombia and our other colleagues around the country. So when we started this work, I thought I need to read more about this. And one of the things that I did was I downloaded the documentary movie Unrest by Dr. Jennifer Gray onto my iPad. And I decided I'd watch it as I was flying home to Ireland from New York. And somewhere, south of Greenland on the map, I was there with tears running down my face. I had no idea just how awful it was. It was a really raw and informative documentary. But one of the things that really came across was in the history of this condition, which has clearly been around for a long time, a lot of our worst impulses as in society clearly come out, because if it's vague and ill-defined and it predominantly affects women, and you can't find any clear diagnostic criteria for it or some confirmatory lab tests, it's very easy to say, as the two of you are undoubtedly aware, that it's all in your mind, you're making it up, it's something that you can dismiss. So that's being clearly disproven, and now we're able to look much more positively at it as a real condition that deserves its own investigation. And it's great to see that attitudes have changed in this way, and it's being treated seriously.
I think that's why these conversations are so important. Of course, the research is what is really needed, but I know that after this video goes out, I'll have people messaging me saying that I brought this video into my doctor. That people are just so grateful, or just grasping onto trying to find something to not only validate their condition, but to help their medical team understand what's going on. So yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to dive into all of this.
I did note that Dr. Sri Lakshmi Raj is on this study with you. and she's a population geneticist. And so I was interested in, will this phase of research analyze differences maybe in disparities or look into environmental factors, or is this just looking at the genes? Is there going to be any other layer to this?
So Shri, as she is called, is an outstandingly talented population geneticist. We're very fortunate that she just joined our faculty at Einstein, and her goal is to use population genetics approaches to try to help understand human disease and help the patients who have these diseases. It's very important to have population genetic skills when you're trying to understand the DNA sequence variation that occurs in people in general. And that in somewhere like the Bronx, which is the most diverse county in the United States, and just as a measure of that, only about 9% of the Bronx from the last US census figures is Northern European white, like myself. Everybody else is from a different background. And that is, it's an enormously interesting, stimulating, invigorating place to work because of all of the different cultures that you get to see and the privilege that you have to be involved with these families and their care. So when you're trying to understand disease and you have already got a lot of variability between any two individuals, and it's amplified in the communities we serve in the Bronx, you need somebody with Shri's skills. More focused on the issue of ME/CFS. ME/CFS affects all communities clearly. Like many conditions, it is more studied in Northern European white individuals than in other races and ethnicities. But even within Northern European white individuals, there are going to be differences for people who are from different parts of Northern Europe. In fact, people from the west of Ireland have differences from people in the other parts of Ireland. It depends on how local you want to go. So if variation already exists, and then you are trying to understand variation that exists in individuals with ME/CFS versus those who do not have ME/CFS, then you need somebody who has the ability to scan all of these differences and understand all of the things that could be causing differences so that they can pick very specifically the ones that are disease associated. So Shri is an invaluable addition to the team because she's bringing those skills to allow us to dissect all of this complexity.
And I know in the UK, they're doing a big Decode project with analyzing the genomes of people there.
We can talk a little bit more about the UK study, which is a very, very welcome addition to the ME/CFS research spectrum that's out there. They are going to try to look at genetic differences that exist in people who have ME/CFS in the UK. It's great. They're going to hopefully get many thousands of people with ME/CFS and be able to look at their genomes. They do a lot of genomic sequencing as a kind of a public initiative within the UK. So they have the potential to really understand some of these genetic influences that could be occurring. There's no guarantee that this is genetic, but there's a pretty good likelihood that there are at least some genetic factors involved. I would draw the distinction between two types of studies that are performed when we do genetic studies. One of them is what they do with the UK Biobank or 23andMe and other entities where you get people to describe their own symptoms in a sort of a questionnaire type of way. That has advantages in that it's quite easy to do that for lots and lots of people pretty quickly. The other way of doing it is to have a deeper examination of the individuals that you want to study. So it would involve visit to a doctor's office or a healthcare facility. And some of these more sophisticated tests, as I was describing, getting people to raise themselves up and watch their blood pressure, those kinds of more detailed clinical tests. It's very difficult to scale that to the same extent as you would with somebody who's just filling out a questionnaire, but you have probably a greater degree of certainty that the people in the latter study have actually got ME/CFS, whereas the 23andMe, when they're doing a study and people are self-reporting their symptoms, it's probably pretty good, but there's probably going to be some inaccuracies in there as well. So I think the two types of studies can be complementary to each other. What we would like to do is to have a very focused study on smaller numbers of individuals, but with very careful assessment of how they look clinically, so that we're very confident they have ME/CFS and not some other condition.
So when we talked before, we had said, is there one ME/CFS, or are there a bunch of subgroups of ME/CFS?
I don't think that there's enough in the published medical literature to be able to answer that question. And I think, in fact, the more important source of information would be the two of you. You're survivors of ME/CFS. You can't understand how happy it makes me to see two people who've had this condition and have bounced back to such an extent. It's not common. You are obviously very fortunate. You've obviously worked very hard. But at the end of the day, to see the two of you doing this work that you're doing to raise awareness and to help the remainder of the community it's exhilarating. So this makes me extremely happy. But what I would do is I would bounce the question back to the two of you, because I think your insights are probably better. What do you think? Do you think that there is more than one ME/CFS? And is it 2? Is it 20? And that's actually kind of important in terms of genetic studies, because if we have many different types of ME/CFS, then it becomes more challenging to find individual genes, because it may be only associated with 1 out of 20 types of ME/CFS, but not impossible. So I'd love to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, I have a quick thought. I do know there are people who have suppressed immune systems, low natural killer cells. I had almost no natural killer cell activity. And then there's like a group who has like very high natural killer cell activity. Or there's people who have recurrent fevers, and then there's other people like myself who wasn't able to fight off colds when I would get them during my ME/CFS experience, and I would just kind of be stuck in day 1 of the flu times 10, but my body wouldn't have normal responses. So I think there are differences in immune responses kind of at both extremes potentially. That's just one observation I had.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and I really appreciate, Dr. Greally, that you putting that back to us. It is nice to have our experiences validated. We are not researchers, but we've talked to so many people. Hundreds of people for sure. I'm losing track. I have people messaging me every day from all over the world. I've interviewed, a few dozen people on this channel, and I know this is all just anecdotal. This does not scientific research make, but I think we get stuck with ME/CFS because we want to think of it like there is a cause and then an illness that follows. But so many of us have different triggers that set it off, and it's really hard to identify that commonality. Someone's in a car accident, they have ME/CFS. Someone gets a bad flu, now they have ME/CFS. Someone is living in a house full of mold, for example, now they have it. But the more people I talk to, it feels like the commonalities are much more than the differences. So to me, it does feel like a common condition. among most of us. I'm sure there's a few that aren't in there, but if I were to put out my best guess, I would say that we are all in there. I think where our community gets a little bit divided is the spectrum of severity of symptoms can make it hard to see this as one illness, because we have people on one end who are still able to work, even though it's incredibly challenging, but they can keep up their life. And on the far other end, we have people who are completely bedbound, who are tube fed, whose feet haven't touched the ground in years. So, it's a tough question. I think it's something we all struggle with, and we're all out there together. So many of us trying to help each other out and find answers, but then we're like, do we even have the same thing? Yeah. It's really tough.
Well, that's a great insight. And remember that we're still early enough in our research of any substance into any CFS. Just over the last several years, people have really started to get funded to do this work, and has brought some numbers in of people like myself who've never had a footprint in this area. We're learning from the patient advocates in our center. We're learning from looking at Dr. Bray's film. We're learning from you. So it's not as if we have answers. There's this temptation to say somebody's got a doctoral degree, and so therefore they must know all the answers. The most important part of looking after patients is humility and understanding that you don't understand everything. You never see the same disease twice, even when it's the same genetic event that I'm looking at in these kids. And of course, as a pediatrician, you have to be humble, because kids will otherwise make fun of you. So you learn some good lessons as a pediatrician along the way, but these lessons should be universal, and we should be having a two-way conversation that allows us to learn from the people who've had these experiences of ME/CFS.
One commonality that I hear from, it's not necessarily every case, but something that's common I hear is in people's use, it was like overprescription of antibiotics, or maybe they were prescribed antibiotics around their onset, or when they did have a virus that set it off, their gut changed. And I know you're studying the human genomics, but it seems that the microbiome also seems to play a big role in this. I'm just curious to know, are you factoring, and is your research at any point, does it factor all the other organisms in our body that also have genes?
In our center, yes. We have a group of people who are studying the gut microbiome, and in the first instance, you're looking for associations. You're looking to see, is there something different about the bacteria and other organisms that live in the gut. In our case, we're focused on the gut. It's a major source of the organisms that live with us. So association is the first step, and then the question of causality comes in. So you have more of a certain type of organism in your gut. Is it actually causing problems, or is it secondary to the fact that perhaps your diet has changed, or it's there, it's associated, but it's not actually causing the problem. It's maybe secondary to some other part of your illness. So that becomes tricky, but fortunately, that's exactly what epidemiologists do for a living, and we have some very smart epidemiologists who work with us, and they are trained to tease apart these relationships so you can work on what's causal and what's merely a passenger along for the ride.
It does seem like with ME/CFS, a lot of this stuff is bidirectional, and then it's almost like you get into this downward spiral. It's like your gut gets bad, and then it all feeds off of one another. And yeah, did you find that too, Raelan?
Yeah, and then all of a sudden your hormones are out of whack, and then you develop these food intolerances, and then it just seems like it's a multi-organ thing, and things just start popping up all over the place. Yeah. I'm curious, because I think one thing, you had referenced COVID-19 earlier, Dr. Greally, and I think the sense that I've gotten from most people who are facing ME/CFS is that a silver lining of this will be because of the resulting cases of what's being termed as long COVID. I think most of us are familiar with that by now. And its similarities with ME/CFS is that this is going to raise awareness. It's going to be taken more seriously. I know you can't speak for all physicians or all researchers, but just generally in your experience, have you seen a rise in awareness or interest in ME/CFS as a result of the pandemic that's been happening?
Yes, it's at the cost of vast numbers of people now having long COVID, which is terrible. But if you take the symptoms that are in common to ME/CFS and long COVID, the fatigue, muscle and joint pain, headache, but also the palpitations, the post-exertion malaise, the orthostatic intolerance, you can't be raised up, fever, cognitive dysfunction, all of these different components to the condition are there in long COVID and in ME/CFS. It's actually a pretty unfortunate overlap of these parts of the spectrum of each condition. So that being the case, people are pretty convinced that the post-viral syndromes are real. There's nothing quite like having a global pandemic to make you realize things about medicine. It's unfortunately it is an unfortunate byproduct of a global catastrophic event which has resulted in millions of people dying, but it has at least allowed us to pay attention to the millions of people who have ME/CFS and realize that there's a legitimacy in what they've been talking about, what you've been talking about for some time. And if I could add, if there are advances to be made in long COVID research, they should translate over to ME/CFS. And the work that we're doing on ME/CFS would hopefully have the ability to understand and potentially treat long COVID. So that's the optimistic take of it.
So, Dr. Greally, what else is important for people to know about this research project that you and your team are embarking on?
Now that we're seeing some differences that define the individuals with ME/CFS versus those who do not, we need to understand why those differences are occurring. One possibility is this idea of epigenetics, as Liz was talking about earlier, where a cell kind of reprograms in response to something that happened to it in the past. And that's certainly something that we can look for. But what we should really be looking for in the short term, because it's a big influence, it's relatively easy to study, and it would be very silly to miss this influence, is to see whether the people with ME/CFS are having these changes in how the cells are behaving in the studies that we're doing because of genetic differences in the people who have the ME/CFS compared to people who don't. So, for example, if there is some sort of a molecule that's being produced by the immune cells, and when it binds to its receptor to have its activity, something that it binds to cause another cell to respond to that molecule, maybe some people that receptor is just not able to bind quite as well. This is a model for how you could have the immune cells responding in different ways in people who have some sort of detrimental condition compared with people who do not have that condition. And the only way to figure that out is to look at their genomes. So we have a pretty comprehensive study that we're doing in our center, the national consortium. But one thing that we could usefully add is genetic characterization of the hundreds of individuals who are the patients that we're studying. So we have some clever strategies for doing that at scale and very cost effectively. And the price of sequencing is continuing to come down very dramatically. So that will become more and more a potential area of research over time. But in the short term, it's where we could make some early strides, because nobody's actually done a detailed study of ME/CFS on the scale of hundreds of patients using these genetic association approaches that we are capable of doing with our very carefully characterized group of patients.
Yeah. So what is the cost of sequencing one person's genome? Just an estimate.
The actual cost of the sequencing is probably of the order of $60 to $90. We don't do sequencing that reveals every single nucleotide in the genome. We do a kind of a more it's a little bit less detailed. So we don't have to use as much sequencing reagents, the actual chemicals that are used for the sequencing, and that brings our costs down. So it's a way of sort of scanning through genomes, identifying differences that exist in big blocks of DNA as opposed to individual, very rare changes that characterize each of us. And that's enough. That's all we need to be able to do in the short term, to be able to see if there's a chunk of DNA on one of our chromosomes that is unusual in the individuals with any CFS compared with those who do not have any CFS. So $60 to $90 is kind of the ballpark that we're talking about. We have to get some DNA into tubes to be able to send it off for that sequencing. And we have to consider some of those as extra costs. But the actual sequencing itself these days is a lot cheaper than when the Human Genome Project was first done, and it was like $1 billion to get that human genome together. It's now become pretty routine.
Yeah, that was the year 2000, right? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
I guess people are going to want to hear. I know we've kind of touched on it. We've talked about the diagnostics and understanding the mechanisms for disease. What would be, or just to understand potential for treatment options that this might potentially lead to?
It really depends on what we find, and I hate being sort of prevaricating about this. Some things are going to be very short paths to treatment. So if you find that you can block a receptor with some sort of molecule that would prevent its abnormal activation, that sort of thing is probably a relatively easy thing to do. If there is something much more complex going on with the way the immune cells form and activate in the body of somebody with ME/CFS, that's going to be more challenging. And then, of course, there's the possibility that it's not immune cells, but it could be the cells of the gut. And all of a sudden, now you have the question of how do I get into the gut and change those cells in some effective way? Whereas immune cells are actually very accessible. You can take them from blood, you can take them from somebody's bone marrow, and you can, when you put them back in, because they're inherently mobile, they can travel throughout the entire body after you return them to the patient's body. So I'm talking very much in theoretical terms here, but it really depends on what cells are important to target with whatever treatment you're talking about. But that's why we do the research. We head down these avenues, we discover what we can, and the moment we discover something, we're scientists, but we're human beings. We'd like to be heroes. We'd like to find something which is going to help millions of people to get out of bed tomorrow morning. So, we'd like people to give us a little round of applause and say, hey, you did well there. So you'll find that this community is very motivated to try to find something that's useful for people who have a very debilitating condition.
Feels like a good segue. Part of the reason that we're all talking today and that Liz and I got involved with you, Dr. Greally, and your team and the people at Kernels is to spread awareness about this research that's happening. But another big part of why we're involved is to help raise funding for this research. So maybe Liz, could you tell us a bit about what that looks like and what we're trying to do here with that?
Yeah, we're trying to raise $40,000 and my husband and I are matching $10,000 and a generous anonymous donor is matching another $10,000. So we need to raise $20,000 from you guys who are listening. And that's going to help get this project to the next step. And it's going to help sequence the genomes and the other costs involved to hopefully lead to more understanding of this debilitating disease.
Yeah, so we're already technically halfway there of our $40,000. So Liz and I are going to be working really hard, and we need to come up with that first 20,000 so that it can be matched. And we're all of us always saying we need more research. We need more research. Now the research is here, it's in front of us. And I think sometimes we think, well, I can only give $5 or $10. What's that going to do? But if every single person who subscribes to my channel, who follows me on social media, gave $5, we would far surpass what we were trying to raise. So I know people who are facing ME/CFS are also often facing serious financial challenges as well. And I appreciate that. I just want people to know that, this research is important, and whatever you could manage to donate will help. It all helps. It all matters. And it will all be appreciated very much. And of course, we'll have the links for how you do that in the video description. To get more information, you can contact myself or Liz, or leave comments under the video if you want to know more before getting involved. But we're just really excited to get the funding in place so we can kick this research off, because it's so desperately needed. Yeah,
and I know many people with ME/CFS lose all their money because you're not able to work, spending it on medical treatments. And if you don't have the money, if you just can share this maybe with your friends, that would be wonderful too, and greatly appreciated.
All right. Well, a massive thank you, Dr. Greally, for your time today. I really appreciate going into depth, for us to help us understand, and for all the work that you're doing for ME/CFS research. It is just so valuable. I just keep thinking what my mother would think, because she had this illness for years and it was such a hopeless situation. She would just be over the moon to hear about the work what you and your team are doing. So thank you so much, Dr. Greally, for everything that you're contributing.
I'd like to applaud the two of you for what you're doing as well. This is immensely valuable.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And also a massive thank you to you, Liz. You are such a great support in this community and have become such a good friend of mine. I feel so fortunate to have you in my life. So thank you as well for connecting all of us with the team at Kernels and getting this all going. You have been instrumental in making all of this happen.
The least I could do. This was wonderful. Yeah.
And thank you to everyone who is watching. You guys are amazing. So, we have connected with people all over the world, and, the support and information and everything that you share is so valuable. So we look forward to your questions in the comments. As Liz said, let's share this video and this research in other social spaces so we can really generate the funding that we need and get this going. Thank you again to both of you. Thank you to everyone who's watching. And that is it for today.